Welcome to this continuing series on the Septuagint. Before going through the New Testament and comparing the Old Testament quotations to the Hebrew Masoretic and the Greek Septuagint, there is one important thing to address. In the third video about the notable differences between the Masoretic and the Septuagint, we looked at the only known problem with the Septuagint, that the genealogy of Genesis 5 places Methuselah's death 14 years after the flood. After sharing that video, I had two viewers point out something important of which I was unaware. In the first video, we talked about the three families of manuscripts, the Masoretic, the Septuagint, and the Samaritan. Remember that within each family, there are manuscripts that are different. It turns out that one of the differences in the Septuagint family of manuscripts is found in Genesis 5:25. The Septuagint found at the Vatican says that Methuselah was 167 years old when he fathered Lamech, the father of Noah. This places the flood 2,242 years after Adam. The Septuagint from the Vatican is used in most translations of the Septuagint, and this is how it was explained in that video. However, the Septuagint found at Alexandria says that Methuselah was 187 when he fathered Lamech. This pushes Lamech's birth, Noah's birth, and the year of the flood back 20 years. And so it places the flood at 2,262 years after Adam. So according to the Alexandrian Septuagint, Methuselah died 6 years before the flood, and not 14 years after the flood, as the Vatican Septuagint states. And so, the only problem with the Septuagint is not even a problem at all for the Alexandrian Septuagint. In the end, there are no known problems with the Greek Septuagint, while the known problems with the Masoretic Old Testament still remain. To review what those are, feel free to watch that portion of the third video in this series. Now that we have cleared up this important aspect of the Septuagint, let's continue comparing the Hebrew Masoretic with the Greek Septuagint by going through the New Testament and seeing which manuscript family the writers used when quoting from the Old Testament. For the New Testament readings and the Hebrew Masoretic readings, I will use the American Standard Version, which is a very accurate translation of both. For the Greek Septuagint readings, I will use Brenton's translation, which is a very accurate translation of the Septuagint. And since these translations were published less than 60 years apart, their readings should be similar. As we go through each passage, we will keep a running count of the family of manuscripts and the number of verses which the New Testament writers followed. Matthew 1:23 is about the prophecy that predicts Christ's birth. It reads, "Behold, the virgin shall be with child, and shall bring forth a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel." This verse was already discussed in the previous video. Click here for more information about it. As we saw, Matthew is following the Septuagint's reading of Isaiah 7:14. Matthew 2:6 is about what the chief priests and the scribes told Herod when he asked them where the Christ would be born. It reads, "And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are in no way least among the princes of Judah, for out of you shall come forth a governor, who shall be shepherd of my people Israel." This is a quotation from Micah 5:2. The Masoretic reads, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, which is little to be among the thousands of Judah, out of you shall one come unto me that is to be ruler in Israel." The Masoretic reads Ephrathah instead of the land of Judah. It is not exactly known what Ephrathah is, but while Bethlehem is the geographical name, Ephrathah is probably the ethnic name for the people of the Bethlehem region. And the last half of the verse is very different. Matthew does not follow the Masoretic. The Septuagint reads, "And you, Bethlehem, house of Ephrathah, are few in number to be reckoned among the thousands of Judah. Yet out of you shall one come forth to me, to be a ruler of Israel." Amazingly, the Septuagint's reading is just like the Masoretic's reading, except it says few in number, when the Masoretic says little. Matthew is indeed using Micah 5:2, but his reading is not really following the Masoretic or the Septuagint. Just as there are differences between English translations today, there were differences between manuscripts back then. It is possible that Matthew is using a manuscript with the genuine reading, but which has since been lost. Neither the Septuagint nor the Masoretic will be counted on this verse. Matthew 2:15 is about when Joseph and Mary fled to Egypt with Jesus to escape Herod. It reads, "Out of Egypt did I call my son." This is a quotation from Hosea 11:1. The Masoretic reads, "I called my son out of Egypt." The Masoretic reads the same, though the order is different. The Septuagint reads, "Out of Egypt have I called his children." The Septuagint says his instead of my, and children instead of son. So while Matthew follows the Septuagint's order, he follows the Masoretic's words. Of the manuscript families we have today, it is too hard to tell which one Matthew is following. Like in the previous quotation, Matthew might be using an ancient manuscript that has since been lost, but more likely, he is simply and purposefully switching the Masoretic's order of Hosea 11:1. Let's say that Matthew is using the Masoretic. Matthew 2:18 is about the mothers whose children were killed by Herod. It reads, "A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she would not be comforted because they are not." This brings up another difference in New Testament manuscripts. The Alexandrian family of manuscripts, which the American Standard Version and most modern translations use, lists two kinds of sadness. The Byzantine family, which include translations such as the New King James, include a third word here, lamentation. This difference in New Testament manuscripts probably exists because of the difference in Old Testament manuscripts, which we are about to see. This quotation is from Jeremiah 31:15. The Masoretic reads, "A voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for them because they are no more." The Masoretic lists two kinds of sadness which agrees with the Alexandrian family of New Testament manuscripts, but disagrees with the Byzantine family of manuscripts. Because the Septuagint has a different order of the chapters in Jeremiah, this quotation is from chapter 38, verse 15. It reads, "A voice was heard in Ramah, of lamentation and of weeping and wailing. Rachel would not cease weeping for her children, because they are not." The Septuagint's three kinds of sadness are a bit different. It agrees with the Byzantine family of New Testament manuscripts, but disagrees with the Alexandrian family of manuscripts. Also, it does not speak about refusing comfort, but instead that Rachel just won't stop weeping. Matthew's quotation is mostly identical to the Septuagint. Though Matthew does not quote either precisely, it seems that he is more closely following the Masoretic. Matthew 2:23 is about how Joseph settled in Nazareth, which became Jesus' hometown. It reads, "He should be called a Nazarene." Incredibly, the Old Testament passage that Matthew is quoting is completely unknown. Jerome wrote that he believed Matthew was using Isaiah 11:1. There, the Hebrew word is netzer, which is translated branch or shoot, as in, "A shoot out of the stalk of Jesse, and a branch out of his roots shall bear fruit." Jerome was confident that this word should be rendered Nazarene. Sadly, since Matthew's quotation cannot be found in today's Masoretic or in today's Septuagint, I will say he follows neither. Maybe Matthew was using Isaiah 11:1. Maybe he used some other Old Testament passage that has since been lost. Or maybe Matthew is not trying to quote the Old Testament, but is showing the truth about Jesus' hometown while poking fun at his contemporary so-called prophets who were giving Nazareth a bad reputation in that day. See John 1:45 and 46. Thus far, we have looked at the first two chapters of Matthew. Matthew 2:6 didn't follow either manuscript family, and Matthew 2:23 isn't found in any Old Testament. Right now, we have one verse that follows the Septuagint, two verses that follow the Masoretic, and two verses that didn't follow either. Things aren't looking so well. But from here on, we will start to see a general pattern in how the New Testament writers will favor the Septuagint over the Masoretic. Matthew 3:3 is about John the Baptist. It reads, "The voice of one crying in the wilderness, make you ready the way of the Lord, make his paths straight." This is a quotation from Isaiah 40:3. The Masoretic reads, "The voice of one that cries, prepare you in the wilderness the way of Jehovah, make level in the desert a highway for our God." The Masoretic says that the wilderness is where the way needs to be prepared, while Matthew says that the wilderness is where the person will be crying out. The Masoretic speaks about building a highway in the desert, while Matthew says people need to make straight ways for God's paths. The Septuagint reads, "The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare you the way of the Lord, make straight the paths of our God." The only difference here is that the Septuagint says, "of our God," while Matthew says, "him." Matthew more closely follows the Septuagint's reading. Let's continue comparing the Hebrew Masoretic with the Greek Septuagint by going through the New Testament and seeing which manuscript family the writers used when quoting from the Old Testament. In this video, we will be looking at Matthew chapters 4 to 5. The running count of verses will continue from the last video, but this time we will add a category for when the New Testament quotation agrees with both the Masoretic and the Septuagint. Matthew 4:4 is about Jesus' response to Satan's temptations. It reads, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God." This is a quotation from Deuteronomy 8:3. The Masoretic reads, "Man does not live by bread only, but by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of Jehovah." The Masoretic says everything instead of every word, but this is okay, because both word and thing are implied by the Hebrew. Remember that Jehovah, Yahweh, and the Lord are all different ways to say the same thing in the Hebrew. However, Matthew said God, and not any of those. The Septuagint reads, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God." Notice that the Septuagint explicitly includes word here. But the thing to take note of is that it says God instead of Jehovah, Yahweh, or the Lord. Matthew more closely follows the Septuagint there. In both the Hebrew and the Greek, Matthew switches around the order of the words, but other than that, his words are the exact same in the Septuagint. Matthew 4:6 is about when Satan quoted Scripture in order to tempt Jesus. It reads, "He shall give his angels charge concerning you, and on their hands they shall bear you up, lest you happen to dash your foot against a stone." This is a quotation from Psalms 91:11 and 12. The Masoretic reads, "He will give his angels charge over you. They shall bear you up in their hands, lest you dash your foot against a stone." The Masoretic reads nearly identical to Matthew's reading. The only difference is that the Masoretic does not include happen. Because the Septuagint numbers the Psalms differently, this is a quotation from Psalms 90:11 and 12, and it reads, "He shall give his angels charge concerning you, and they shall bear you up on their hands, lest at any time you dash your foot against a stone." In the Septuagint, it includes "at any time," which is the exact same Greek word Matthew uses, which the ASV translated as happen. Because this word is missing in the Masoretic, and because Matthew's quotation is identical to the Septuagint, he follows the Septuagint's reading. Matthew 4:7 is about Jesus' response to Satan's temptation. It reads, "You shall not make trial of the Lord your God." This is a quotation from Deuteronomy 6:16. The Masoretic reads, "You shall not tempt Jehovah your God." The Septuagint reads, You shall not tempt the Lord your God. The ASV translated the word trial instead of tempt, but these are the same words. Since all three passages agree, Matthew's reading follows the Septuagint and the Masoretic. Matthew 4:10 is about what Jesus said to Satan when being tempted. It reads, You shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve. This is a quotation from Deuteronomy 6:13. The Masoretic reads, You shall fear Jehovah your God, and him shall you serve. The second half in the Masoretic says nothing about serving God only. The Septuagint reads, You will fear the Lord your God, and him only will you serve. Interestingly, though Breton translated only in this verse, it is not there in the Septuagint either. Both the Masoretic and the Septuagint say to fear God. However, Matthew said to worship God. For some reason, Jesus said worship instead of quoting fear from the Old Testament passage. Probably because worship is what Satan asked for in the previous verse. So in this case, the Masoretic and the Septuagint agree with each other, but they are not the same as Matthew's quotation. This is because I believe Jesus' words are intentionally different. He is loosely following both the Septuagint and the Masoretic. Matthew 4:15 and 16 are about when Jesus moved from Nazareth to Capernaum. It reads, The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, toward the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people that sat in darkness saw a great light, and to them that sat in the region and the shadow of death, to them did light spring up. This is a quotation from Isaiah 9:1 and 2. The Masoretic reads, The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the latter time has he made it glorious, by the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. They that dwell in the land of the shadow of death, upon them has the light shined. The Septuagint reads, O land of Zebulun, land of Naphtali, and the rest inhabiting the seacoast, and the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. O people walking in darkness, behold a great light. You that dwell in the region and the shadow of death, a light shall shine upon you. The Septuagint says the people are walking in darkness, while Matthew says the people are sitting in darkness. Also, the phrase following Zebulun and Naphtali, and preceding the Jordan, is different between them all. Which reading is Matthew following? In some ways, neither, and in some ways, both. Let's say that Matthew is following both, pulling from both manuscript families. Matthew 5:21 is part of the Sermon on the Mount. In his teaching on murder and anger, Jesus quotes the Old Testament. He said, You have heard that it was said of them of old time, You shall not kill, and whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. This is a quotation from Exodus 20:13 and Deuteronomy 5:17. The Masoretic reads, You shall not kill. The Septuagint reads, You shall not kill. Of course, being such a short verse and part of the Ten Commandments, also called the Decalogue, we should expect that all manuscripts of Scripture should keep this commandment unchanged through all the centuries and millennia and copyists. All manuscripts are in agreement. Matthew 5:27 is in the same situation. In Jesus' teaching on adultery and lust, he said, You have heard it was said, You shall not commit adultery. This is a quotation from Exodus 20:14. The Masoretic reads, You shall not commit adultery. Both Exodus 20:14 and Deuteronomy 5:18 in the Septuagint read, You shall not commit adultery. Jesus' quotation of Exodus 20:14 agrees in all manuscripts. Matthew 5:31 and 5:33 look like quotations from the law. However, Jesus doesn't quite quote them directly. He refers to them by condensing them into fewer words without changing the meaning. Matthew 5:31 is a condensation of Deuteronomy 24:1. Matthew 5:33 is a condensation of Exodus 19:12, Numbers 30 verse 2, and Deuteronomy 23:21. These verses do not help us compare the Septuagint and the Masoretic because they are not direct quotations. We will skip them. Matthew 5:38 is a quotation which begins Jesus' teaching on non-resistance. He said, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." This is a quotation from Exodus 21:24, Leviticus 24:20, and Deuteronomy 19:21. Just like with the previous verses from the Ten Commandments, there is no difference between any manuscript. The only exception is that Jesus adds the word "and," which does not appear in Hebrew nor Greek. But this has very little significance. For example, Jesus could be quoting two separate statements, as it is shown here, denoted by the question marks. In the end, all manuscripts agree. Matthew 5:43 is Jesus' last quotation in his Sermon on the Mount. As he begins to teach about loving your enemies, he said, "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy.'" This is a quotation from Leviticus 19:18. The Masoretic reads, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." The Septuagint reads, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." Jesus just quotes a very small portion of the verse, and all manuscripts are in agreement. That is enough for now, but we will continue looking at New Testament quotations from the Old Testament next year. The next time Matthew quotes from the Old Testament is in chapter 8. Blessings, and so forth.